Welcome to the 10th and final episode of HuntStand's Deer Dirt for the 2024 series. Today I want to tackle the subject of how many does you should shoot. And this can be a real challenge because there's so many variables involved. So I'm going to try to lay out a few situations and then go through the process of figuring out where to go from there. So in other words, I'm going to try to help you come up with this decision on your own. A lot of times people will actually bring in outside consultants if the situation is challenging or complicated enough. And I've done some of that. I've done some private consulting work, but you can figure this stuff out yourself, at least to get started. You don't need to hire somebody to do this. So let's look at situation number one, and let's assume that you're in an area that has fairly low deer numbers. And by low, you're looking at the indicators like crop damage, the damage to the habitat. Is there a browse line? Are the farmers up in arms about the deer? If they aren't, if you're in an area where the population is, let's say, low enough that there aren't these types of indicators, but also not so low that the hunting is poor. So in other words, let's say you're in a stable population that's pretty good, pretty solid. The whole idea is just to keep it there. So if that's the case, the experts that I've talked to say that to hold any population in check, you need to kill anywhere between 25% and a third, 33% of the adult deer in that range. So if it's an area, especially an agricultural area where the deer multiply really fast, you might have to push that just a little bit. You might have to be in the 25 plus side of it. But if you're in an area where the population doesn't grow as fast because the range just isn't as good, the quality of the feed, what the deer eat isn't as good, maybe more of a big woods setting, you might be on the 25% or a little bit lower side. And that's to hold the population. That's not to make any changes. So let's say you've got 120 acres. Let's say there's 20 adult deer. So that's bucks and does. Based on this information or this method of determining harvest, you would be taking 5 deer off that property. Well, you're not going to shoot 5 bucks. And no doubt you can get multiple antlerless tags. So you're probably looking at shooting anywhere from, say, 3 or 4 does and maybe a buck to maybe 4 or 5 does and no buck. And that may sound easy enough, but it's not so simple as it sounds. A lot of times you have to shoot everything that comes within bow range if you're a bow hunter, on the doe side, if the population is, moderate, because you're not going to get a lot of opportunities. It's not like if you've got 20 deer there and 15 of them are does, that they're going to constantly keep parading past your stand. It's not going to happen. So you got to be fairly aggressive. Anytime you're trying to hold the population, you have to be fairly aggressive. You can't just assume that sometime close to the end of the season, I can make good on this and I can, get caught up if I fall behind. It doesn't work like that. You have to stay on the gas when it comes to shooting does all season long. Okay, so now let's take a different situation. I own land in southern Iowa for, I owned that one farm for 18 years, and the population was pretty high during that whole time. It was never a situation where the deer population was low enough that you could just say, well, we don't have to shoot much now. We had a really bad outbreak of EHD in 2012, and maybe there was a year or two there where we could kind of sit back and didn't have to be quite as aggressive. But prior to that, it was pretty much, shoot every doe that came within bow range. And then shortly after that, once the population started to rebound, it went right back to that again. So let's talk about how that worked. It was kind of an interesting study. The deer density in that area was high. I would say it was anywhere from 125 to 150 deer per square mile. So, I mean, a square mile is 640 acres. So if you had, so that'd be a deer per every 4 to 5 acres. So every 4.5 acres, there was a deer. That's pretty high density. And granted, there was a lot of ag around there, so there was a lot of food, but that's still a very high density when it comes to, you know, deer in a natural state, reaching their potential and not over browsing and damaging the habitat, or, you know, causing a problem with the local farmers. So I was constantly battling the does, and I remember a few years there, myself, my neighbors, my friends, anybody that I could get on board, we shot every doe that we possibly could. And I think we did that for about 3 seasons, and that brought the population down, but it did something really interesting, and it flipped the buck to doe ratio, because we weren't killing hardly any bucks. And we might kill 30 does for every buck that we killed, you know, in that group. Maybe it was even more than that, but we killed lots of does, almost no bucks. And after a few years of that, we had an honest, I believe, 3 bucks for every doe on that farm. So like I said, it was an interesting experiment, and we could talk about what the behavior of the deer was like after that, because everybody would assume that all the bucks would leave during the rut, and you know, that you'd never have a successful season hunting bucks after that. But that never really proved to be the case. You know, the deer don't have a way to communicate outside of their range. So as long as the area that they were used to living in didn't extend into a pocket of high doe density, they didn't know that there were such places. So they just moved a lot more during the rut. They didn't necessarily leave. So it was really interesting. One quick story and then I'll move on, but I had a neighbor call me one time during the firearm season, and he said, you know, I just saw a buck limping crossing the road, you know, on your farm. Can I go in there and shoot him? And I said, Dan, if you shot every deer on my farm that's limping, there wouldn't be any bucks left, because the competition for the does was so hard, so strong, that the bucks were fighting all the time. So that's one situation. We literally shot every doe that we could for several years, and that did eventually bring the population to a stable number. And obviously you need a state or you have to be in a state where the regs allow you to do that. Seems like most of them are becoming more and more in line with some of the management goals. So it allows us to get the tags that we need to shoot the number of does that we need to. So now let's look at a situation where you're below the comfortable carrying capacity of the area. So maybe we're looking at a truly big woods situation. You know, I've talked to people that hunt in the, you know, the northeastern U.S., Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and they all claim that there's almost no deer in some of those areas. And I've never hunted those areas myself, so I don't know. Obviously, I can rely on what they say. In places like that, you probably don't need to shoot, you know, more than 1 or 2 for the freezer, whatever, you know, whatever you want to take for eating. If you can shoot 1 buck and 1 doe, or whatever the case may be, it's not like you have this pressing need to bring the herd down. But in so many of the areas that I've been in the Midwest, and in somewhat to a lesser degree in pockets of the Southeast, even in the West, gosh, I've been to places in Wyoming and Idaho, Montana, that were just overloaded with deer. I mean, they didn't shoot near enough does, and it's really hard on the habitat. It's hard on the stress levels of the deer. It's hard on the agriculture in those areas. So I guess my point is, if you're in an area that has a stable and comfortable level, you do have to maintain that. You still have that responsibility to kill, you know, 25% to 1/3 of the adult deer. If you're in an area that's overpopulated, like I was for a while down there in southern Iowa, you almost have to shoot everything that you possibly can until you get that population down to that comfortable level. I remember one of my friends in southern Iowa, he killed 5 or 6 does one day out of a ground blind with his bow. And he came up with a strategy for shooting does. Once he got the first one on the ground, he'd go get it and drag it 30 yards upwind of the blind, And then all the rest of the deer that came out in the field, they would circle that on the downwind side. So that would put him about 15 to 20 yards away from his blind, staring at that down doe on the upwind side. So he just kept stacking them up. So people come up with methods for shooting them. They get creative. So I guess one of the takeaways from this video should be that you can't wait until the end of the season to take care of all your doe shooting, because if you do that, you're going to tend to miss your quota. I mean, I've tried that before, it doesn't work. For me to do a good job of shooting the necessary number of deer, I have to do it throughout the entire bow season as well. So hopefully this at least gives you some kind of a scale of figuring out how many does to shoot. Again, keep it simple. If the population is stable and you like the number, 25% of the adult deer. If the population's too high, really as many as you can. As many as you legally can shoot for a while. It might be 2 or 3 years before you get that population down to that more comfortable, stable level. And if you're in an area that has a low density, below the capacity of the area to carry, then just shoot whatever you want for the dinner table, and that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Go back and watch the other 9 episodes and leave comments, leave questions. I check in here quite a bit. The Deer Dirt series, I've really enjoyed producing it, and hopefully you've enjoyed watching it, but I do go back, and if I find questions from viewers on any of the topics, I jump back in there and do the best I can to answer them or point them in a direction to somebody who can. Well, I appreciate you joining me here. I'll see you hopefully back here again next year for another episode of HuntStand's Deer Dirt.